shocked. But I am Andrew Oros. I'm the author of the 2008 book, Normalizing Japan, Politics, Identity, and the Evolution of Security Practice, and with Yuki Tatsumi of Global Security Watch Japan. But today, my job is to set the context for our panel and to moderate our three excellent speakers. Misha Aslan sends his regrets, but he's done us a great service by composing such a strong panel, including representation from 3 continents. So I will introduce our speakers briefly in a moment, but first I'd just like to set the context for this panel on Japan and extended deterrence and reassurance. I want to build on what we've already heard at our excellent opening session, and also let me thank the organizers for that opening session and for this whole conference. First, we have a world today where there are fewer nuclear weapons than in the past, but there are more states that possess these nuclear weapons. Second, as you know, there's been a de-emphasis of nuclear weapons in U.S. policy, including in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. So there's a real question of how to maintain the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence with fewer nuclear weapons. And third, we seem to be facing a messier world in the context of security, and certainly in this neighborhood as well, including increasing military capabilities of North Korea and of China. And so we've seen a reaction to this already, reflected in Japan's new National Defense Program guidelines. The idea of dynamic defense has come up, and I imagine our panelists will talk about this. In fact, Sugio Takahashi, one of our panelists, is one of the co-authors of that term. Also, we've seen evolving U.S. defense concepts like air-sea battle. So looking ahead, I think we have a number of challenges that our panelists will probably address. How to control the so-called escalation ladder, whether it's really possible to deter North Korea, and if it is, what's the right strategy? How to balance between strategic level reassurance and tactical level assurances. And also, I think there's questions about the degree of United States political will in the context of the idea of deterrence. So it's not just a capability issue. So we have 3 great panelists to talk to us about this. I thought we'd start with Sugio Takahashi, who's a fellow at the National Institute for Defense Studies, where I also was an invited researcher recently. And he was one of the co-authors of Japan's new National Defense Program guidelines. Then we'll next go to Martin Fackler, who's the Tokyo bureau chief of the New York Times. I love his work. If you haven't been reading it, I think he's really spot on in understanding some of the changes Japan's been going through. And finally, we have a European edition and also someone who can set more of the regional context for us. Victoria Took, who's just in the next month or 2 is finishing her PhD at the University of Warwick. So she's flying over here just for a few days to share her views with us. And you might want to ask her some questions about her work also on Japan-India issues. So without further ado, Sugio, please.
Thank you. It's my great honor to talk about the Japanese extended deterrence issue in this conference. And my name is Sugio Takahashi, working in needs, and now I'm currently seconded to Ministry of Defense Strategic Planning Office. As my this capacity, I work with the government. I work in government to draft the National Defense Program guideline last year. I have 3 topics. The first one is official declaratory policy of extended deterrence by Japanese government, which is articulated by National Defense Planning Guidelines. The second one is in extended deterrence perspective, what is worry about? Or, in other words, extended deterrence for what? And the third topic is what is necessary and what do I need to be assured? Because assurance is one big topic on this session. And I have just 10 minutes. I will start that. And I give you this PowerPoint handout to explain the Japanese declaratory policy on extended deterrence. One side, reference to extended deterrence in the past NTPGs, is a kind of historical expression what Japanese government say about extended deterrence. The opposite side extended deterrence in NDPG 2010 is, the translation of the latest National Defense Program Guidelines 2010 version that was actually released in December. And National Defense Program Guideline is a capstone document of Japanese defense policy, defense posture. It includes threat perception, roles, mission, and capabilities, and force structure. How many tanks, how many vessels, how many fighters. So this is something like, the US QDR like document. But the difference from QDR is this is no regular cycle. There is no regular cycle of review. The first one was established in 1976, second one 1995, third one 2004. The latest one was released in the last December. So the cycle is very, ad hoc. And in this latest NDPG has big change. In deterrence terms, there are two big changes. One thing, it invented the concept of dynamic deterrence to compete with, peaceful competition with China. And the second one is it completely changed the paragraph of extended deterrence. If you look at this page, that's, refers to extended deterrence in the past NDPGs, as I said, NDPG is a capstone document of defense policy, and its main purpose is to explain why we have this force structure. But it has one paragraph of extended deterrence. And this page shows, the translation of that specific paragraph of extended deterrence. So basically, these three versions have the same expression, same reference to extended deterrence. That is, Japan will continue to rely on the U.S. nuclear deterrence. To protect its territory and people against the threat of nuclear weapons, Japan will continue to rely on the U.S. nuclear deterrence, which is what is that. But it doesn't say anything about how much nuclear deterrence is important. And it sounds like something like nuclear, something like sole purpose or NFU-like argument. So we'd like to change this paragraph in the latest review. And we had 4 issues. One thing, regional nuclear threat, North Korea and China. And the second one, new triad or regional security architecture like US concept. That means combination of not just nuclear elements, combination of missile defense, conventional strike capability are now very important part of deterrence. The third one, still for Japan, the nuclear component of extended deterrence is important. And the fourth one, how do we say about Japan's role in regional missile defense? These 4 big issues are we are thinking about to review that paragraph. And then final product is this in this box. And I don't want to read everything that it said. How much nuclear is important? Nuclear elements of U.S. strategic deterrence is important. What kinds of role Japan should play in the missile defense, or something like that. And I included in this paragraph. So if you have some questions, please ask me after that. And what is worry about topic, or extended deterrence or what? In Japanese strategic environment, I think we should distinguish 2 different challenges. One thing is deter actual nuclear use, deter actual nuclear use or actual nuclear blackmail. So in that sense, this is more like immediate deterrence in the nuclear deterrence theory world. The second challenge is to focus on, to look at on the nuclear, the work of nuclear weapon, the work or the effect of nuclear balance on to shape overall strategic balance, or to shape the perception of regional actors. So if you think, now we can have deter China, if one regional country thinks, now we have enough nuclear capability to deter China, it can be, that country can take more aggressive policy than before. So this is more like, general deterrence in nuclear deterrence world. Or, in this context, I really worry about the so-called stability-instability paradox. No, stability-instability paradox means stability in general strategic level may make the instability in very low-level regional conflict. For example, recently, South Korean security experts are very familiar with this situation that, North Korean nuclear, their own, they believe they have nuclear deterrence, and, the combination of the conventional provocation. So, this kind of, stability and instability interaction is one of, I'm very worried about that. So, we need to think extended deterrence issue in the two contexts. One thing is to deter specific nuclear use of nuclear weapon. The second one is to shaping effect of nuclear strategic balance. And the third topic is, what is necessary to be assured? What do I need to be assured? So there could be several elements. One thing, for example, declaratory policy of U.S. government. The NPR, last year NPR shows a very strong commitment to extend deterrence toward allied countries. So this is a very good assurance effect on me or as a Japanese strategic expert. The second one is alliance statement. This is partly a kind of declaratory policy, but for example, in 2006 or 2009, North Korean missile launch or nuclear test, immediately after that, U.S. government or the U.S. Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense or President reaffirm the commitment of extended deterrence or nuclear extended deterrence against Japan. So that kind of things is very good assurance effect for Japanese. And the third element is actual military cooperation. For recent case, recent combined disaster relief operation or nuclear counter-nuclear crisis operation. That is a very good effect, good sign for extended deterrence. Or everyday military cooperation is another important part of reassurance. And the fourth element is, of course, a consultation. Consultation for what is, of course, an important problem. And, in publicly, the government said there have been 2 official extended deterrence consultation rounds in this February, last February or March, or last year February. And this consultation is very important. Some of Japanese strategic thinkers say we should have something like a nuclear planning group in NATO. I have different opinion, but not necessarily the same as NPG in NATO. But to discussing nuclear issue, to discuss something like between the line elements of between the line interpretation of each country's official document is very important. For example, this NDPG is between the line. What do I think about that? What did I think about that? Or what did the United States think about NPG, NPR last year? And something like that. Such kind of consultation is very good to reassure the Japanese government or Japanese security experts. And again, in extended deterrence in Japan, we should think 2 different issues. One thing is actual use, to deter actual use of nuclear weapon or actual nuclear blackmail. The second one is shaping effect on regional strategic balance. Under the current strategic situation, the latter one is more important than the first one, the former one. So in that sense, every efforts to reassure Japan should mainly focus on the latter one. That means the general strategic balance one. So, in other words, to deter specific nuclear weapons, now we have presidential statement. Now we have range of deterrence to Japan. So that is, have some maximum reassurance statement by the U.S. government. So, but still, we need to discuss what is necessary to shape the favorable strategic balance or to shape the strategic perception of regional countries, including North Korea or China. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sugio. Martin?
Is this on? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Sugio. I'd like to appreciate my gratitude for being here. I'm not the kind of specialist that Andrew or Sugio are, so I will try to talk in broader terms, just what I see in the region. I do think if we're talking about extended deterrence and Japan's nuclear deterrence, which I think is really the topic of this whole conference, is nuclear issues, it's a very interesting time in Japan because, as Sugio was talking about, in terms of conventional military strategy, Japan is undergoing some pretty substantial changes. You're seeing a shift from north to south. You're seeing a shift away from ground forces aimed at a Soviet invasion in Hokkaido to air and sea forces down near Okinawa. You're seeing a real sort of strategic rethinking of how Japan defends itself in conventional terms. The nuclear side has tended to be a lot more static, I think. I mean, there is some change of phrasing, which I think Sugio has highlighted for us here. But basically, Japanese nuclear strategy, if you think about it's just literally at the most obvious level, has not changed for 50 years. Japan does not have nuclear weapons, and there's very little discussion in Japan of acquiring nuclear weapons. I would say there's more discussion here in South Korea than there is in Japan about acquiring nuclear weapons. And the U.S. umbrella, I think, remains the cornerstone of how Japan thinks in these issues. And just recently, Japan was asking Washington for reassurances along those lines. And I'm going to go a little bit out on a limb to say that so long as the U.S. alliance exists with Japan, and so long as U.S. bases are in Japan, with some 50,000 military personnel, if you count the 7th Fleet, that Japan will not go nuclear. I think that so long as the U.S. military is in Japan, I see it very hard to imagine Japan going nuclear, unless there's some significant development in East Asia that changes things. But the way it is now, I think instead of going nuclear, Japan has 50,000 American military personnel. I think that's essentially the way I look at it. However, having said that, I think it's a very interesting time because we're seeing some significant changes in Japan's environment, external environment, and also domestically. And as I was listening to the previous panel, I jotted down some of those changes. So, the first one I think is external. I think Japan, it's a lot less secure. Japan feels a lot less secure, so I should say. This goes back, I think, to 1998 when a Taepodong missile sailed over Japan, which I think was a real shock to folks in Japan. We saw Japan respond by sending up its first spy satellite, for example. The abductions by North Korea. This is one of these things like when I was in Japan in the late 80s, we used to hear about the abductions, and it was something kind of like the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot. You didn't really take it very seriously that Japanese were being abducted by North Korea. And then it turned out, lo and behold, it was true, and Koizumi-san brought back 5 of them in 2002, I think it was. So I guess you can gather from this, initially Japan's feeling of insecurity came from North Korea. I'd argue that recently it's that source of insecurity and anxiety has shifted to China. And we know the recent story of the Chinese trawler captain arrested off of the Senkakus or the Diaoyu Islands. It seems like every few weeks or months the Chinese Navy sails ships between Okinawa and Miyako Islands, which gets a lot of attention, at least in the Yomiuri newspaper and in the Japanese press more broadly. And I think there's just a real sense that China is the sort of threat that North Korea could never be. It's a threat not just in terms of having a nuclear device, but also a threat economically, politically, and to Japan's own standing, and also to the standing of Japan's protector and patron, the United States. There is a lot of anxiety in Japan, though I don't think it's often expressed on the surface, about U.S. commitment. and the possibility that the day will come when U.S. abilities no longer are capable of meeting U.S. promises or commitments. There's also a lot of anxiety that the U.S. will simply jettison Japan. You know, you hear the G2 formulation a lot more in Japan than you hear in the U.S. Japan, not Japan bashing, but Japan passing is something you hear a lot as well. And the idea, again, being that Japan is sort of, as it's fallen in significance, that the U.S. will no longer want to commit U.S. gold and blood to the defense of Japan. And so I think there is in the back of the minds of many folks in Japan and planners at MOD as well, I believe, of what to do, you know, how to prepare for the day when the U.S. won't be there. Another important thing to keep in mind is Japan's own role in the world. I mean, if we're talking about the possibility of American decline, we also need to talk about Japanese decline. And that's certainly, I think, part of the context that Japan is thinking, within which Japan is thinking. You know, Japan was the dominant Asian power for a century. Okay, it was the dominant military power, obviously before World War II, and I would say after World War II as well, at least potentially. There was sort of an American cap on things, but everyone sort of saw Japan as the most serious Asian player. These days, that title, if you will, is being taken over increasingly by China. And we also see Japan declining in other ways. You know, Japan isn't the pile of money that it used to be. Japanese defense spending has been declining. It's down about 5% since 2001. And this is not a shift towards pacifism in Japan. Japan has a lot of anxiety about its environment. This is simply the fact that Japan can't afford to keep spending more money. And so some of these shifts that Sugio was talking about with more submarines and more aircraft, and Japan's also talking about building a U.S. Marine Corps style amphibious ground-based unit. A lot of these new expenditures will be taken care of by cuts to tanks, artillery, and ground forces up in Hokkaido. So you actually will see the number of Japanese main battle tanks is shrinking, the number of artillery pieces will be shrinking at the same time as the number of submarines are increasing. So it's kind of a zero-sum game, or even a shrinking game, because the overall defense budget, again, has been shrinking. Interesting also, I think, in the Japanese context is Japan's responses to this. Domestically, I think it's gotten really interesting in Japan. And, you know, under the LDP for 50-some-odd years, and if you count the liberals and the Democrats, essentially since World War II, these guys had ruled Japan. Essentially, there was almost a reflexive U.S.-centered security policy or foreign policy. Under the when the Democrats took power, the DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan, when they took power in 2009, in one of the biggest political upheavals in Japan, probably since World War II, they opened up this Pandora's box of talking about Japan's standing in the region. The first DPJ Prime Minister, Hatayama, was talking about maybe going to more of an Asianist direction. Ozawa Ichiro, sort of the kingmaker of the party, was talking about more of a UN-focused direction, but kind of pulling away from the U.S. in both cases. Hatayama fell flat on his face, and they had a number of problems. But with the new Prime Minister Khan, we've seen a shift back to the U.S. And the folks now in charge in the party, not just Prime Minister Khan, but people like Marihara Seiji and a lot of these folks are much more, they've kind of brought the shift back to the U.S. But the fact is that the cat is out of the bag, and that we're now in a different era in Japan where different possibilities can be discussed. Let's see. But I think in terms of the shift back to the U.S., one thing to note is that China has been a driver of that. That anxieties about China have really pushed Japan back to the U.S. I think if you look at the reasons why Japan kind of turned against Hatayama last year, some of these incidents involving China, this is before the Chinese trawler captain, but some of these, there was some incidents involving a Chinese helicopter buzzing Japanese warships, really served to push Japanese public opinion away from sort of an Asianist swing and back towards closer ties to the U.S. and to Washington. I also think, as I get to the end here, or near the end, that the March 11 disaster in Japan, if you look at what happened there, I do believe, I had the opportunity to to join the U.S. military and also the Japanese military during some of the operations up in Tohoku, up in northeastern Japan. And I just think that there are places in Iwate Prefecture where the Americans were there first before the Japanese. And I just think that sort of on-the-ground help and having U.S. helicopters flying in and delivering food and water and clothing right after the disaster, that stuff matters. I just think that builds up a bedrock of support. And it even, if you talk to some folks up in the Northeast, it even gives the sense that maybe the Americans are more competent at handling these things than the Japanese government is. But there's definitely this sense of the U.S. was there when folks needed it. And so I think 3/11, especially on the humanitarian side, but perhaps also on the nuclear side eventually, there were some initial problems, but I think they worked them out. Also, I think, has served to push Japan closer to the U.S. I think I'll stop there. I think the final thing I'd say is one of the interesting things about the Boei Taiko, the new guidelines that Sugio was talking about, is that it seems to also point Japan towards, or direct Japan towards developing a more well-rounded military. And this is a point that you hear people kind of talk about in private, but the Japanese media, and it's not really discussed in public. But it's moving away from sort of this lopsided just defending the home islands to a military that has a multi-dimensional, if you will, capability: air, sea, land, logistics, resupply, missile defense. I mean, you're really seeing Japan develop a well-rounded military that can handle Japan's defense. And I think the reason for that, as I mentioned before, is that there is a lot of anxiety in Japan about long-term U.S. commitments and long-term U.S. abilities to protect those commitments. And if we do see a day when the U.S. can no longer fulfill its commitments in Japan, whether for political or economic reasons or whatever, I think there we really need, that's where the issue of a nuclear Japan really becomes a serious issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Martin. And last but not least, Victoria, please.
Hi there, good afternoon everyone, and thank you for coming to this panel. As Andrew's already said, I'm just completing my PhD on Japanese foreign policy towards India, and again I want to say thank you to the organisers for bringing us all together. So this afternoon I'd like to discuss some of the comparisons I see in the situation in Japan and India when it comes to deterrence, and since time's tight I'm going to go straight to my main areas of contrast, but I've got a paper written if anyone wants to see this in greater context. So it's been argued that whilst extended deterrence served an important purpose during the Cold War, that the concept is now dead. But I think that it still remains a useful tool for the stability of the East Asian region. But the scope of it is no longer what it was, and I think these changes are what needs to be recognised and addressed by policymakers in both Washington and in guarantee states. So I think it's indisputable that whilst the requirements for extended the requirements have changed from when the United States first put forward this policy. I don't think it was thinking of 2011 in its policy planning, and generally policymakers don't like to think too far in the future. But I think the world now faces some new challenges which need different responses. I think the first is from terrorism, particularly nuclear terrorism, as someone was mentioning earlier. The second is from piracy, which has sort of increased recently with people's dependence on certain sea lanes. And also telecommunications. Whilst it's often seen as bringing a lot of prosperity to globalization, it's also brought the advent of cyber attacks, which people are now having to try and deal with. And also the emergence of bipolarity, which calls into question the bipolar Cold War-inspired system that extended deterrence has sort of relied upon. And so in this context, Japan has, as Martin said, become increasingly concerned with America's commitment to come to its defense. Whilst the threat has decreased in Europe, you could say that in Northeast Asia it's heightened. And with the Bush administration's removing North Korea from its blacklist and sort of making more attempts to prevent proliferation rather than the elimination of nuclear weapons, this kind of concern has grown, as it has with Obama's call for a world free of nuclear weapons. So one of the issues I think in the difference between the US and Japan in this is through threat perceptions. So whilst the US continues to see terrorism as the major threat to its own security, in Japan it's much more state actors. So North Korea, China and Russia, even though Japan has had some experience of a terrorist threat, it's nothing like as seen as aggressive as these states could be. And you can see the unease of Japanese policymakers in the reaction to the retirement of the Tomahawks. Even though they weren't necessarily helping extend deterrence, it was the symbolic issue that represented. And also the disagreements over sole purpose and no first use have shown sort of some differences in perceptions. But looking at Japan and India, which is what I'm currently researching, their nuclear narratives sort of run in parallel in some ways, in that they both promote nuclear disarmament, they both have a no first use policy and believe in robust deterrence. But India has shown itself much more willing to sort of use the nuclear option, whereas in Japan it still remains quite taboo. So both Japan and India, they also share similar security threats which emanate from their imposing neighbour, being China. But I think they also have similar threats from their respective unstable and former adversaries, being North Korea and Pakistan. And I think for both countries, there's both just enough capability and crucially intention to inflict harm on the other, which I think isn't the situation so much with Beijing. So if Beijing launches any attack, you're sort of risking global Armageddon, whereas it's a bit more, it's not quite as simple as that when it comes to North Korea and Pakistan. And an issue that both of them also share is in identifying how decisions are made. So when dealing with China, Japanese and Indian policymakers can forge relationships in Beijing and refer to as a kind of doctrine when it comes to nuclear. But in North Korea, it's been labelled a pariah state, and Pakistan a failed one, so that where the line between military and civilian rule is unclear. And I think the question of rationality is also important, because since deterrence is very much in the eye of the beholder, the rationality of states has proved a sort of additional problem. So for some, they might see the policies of Pyongyang as very well thought out and rational in order to gain the most out of what limited international interactions they pursue, whilst for others, North Korea is just run by a madman who's bent on securing his legacy to even if that means obliterating his own people. But of course, the issue isn't so much whether I or indeed we think that North Korea is rational or not. It's what policymakers in Japan and Washington think. So indeed, intentions can be more important than capability when you're talking about nuclear. So even though China holds a stronger force when it comes to nuclear, when you don't know what the intentions are, North Korea could be more of a threat. And similarly, in India, strategists believe that Pakistan to be quite a substantial threat, because even more so than North Korea, because whilst in North Korea you have one man who's making all the decisions, in Pakistan it's still very unclear, and increasingly so, who holds control. So under President Musharraf, there was sort of the military and civilian leadership was sort of seen as one and the same thing, but increasingly it's becoming more complicated, and the army itself is not even unified. And I think after the aftermath of Osama bin Laden's killing demonstrates that, in seeing how close his compound was to the Pakistani army camp. And there's this big fear in India of sort of scattered bunkers across Pakistan, and it's very easy for them to get into the wrong hands, which Japan doesn't have to worry about that now, but obviously it all depends on what the leadership transition is going to be like, to who actually makes decisions then. But of course, both Japan and India share this common concern with China's modernization, military modernization, and the increasingly aggressive stance that we've seen. And you can see in both countries, whilst they've both previously been quite hesitant about mentioning China as a security threat, you're noticing it much more in the rhetoric coming out of Tokyo, as you've said. And Delhi in particular is very keen not to talk about China. But you can see it's becoming increasingly evident in their rhetoric as well. And it's sort of seen as an open secret, that the fact that the missiles that India is developing have the capability of reaching China's northern cities. You can't ignore the reality. But of course, both Japan and India have taken very different steps in how to address these threats, with Japan siding with the US and India taking a very independent stance. As Martin said, and I agree with him, the chances of Japan having a nuclear weapon of its own are very slim. But I think, leading on from that, the likelihood of India ever joining any kind of nuclear deterrent structure is even smaller. In the 1960s, India did try and join some kind of US, Britain, France agreement, but they're rebuffed and have since become very autonomous in their approach and refusing to compromise anything in their own foreign policy strategy. And even the US-India relationship has become a lot less promising as people might have thought a year or two ago, and so it's far from the stage when US credibility could be sort of relied upon. So you can see this in the fact that whilst India is decreasing its reliance on the Soviet Union for military, it's diversifying and looking for all different options. And the recent sort of snub of not accepting the US deal for fighter jets is an example of how India is taking its own course. And also, I think, again, as I mentioned, that Japan and India differ vastly in their international confidence. So whilst Japan is very concerned that it's losing value to the United States with its economy stagnant, politics and some kind of paralysis and international activity diminishing, and also this G2 fear and US interest in Russia and China seen as more important than Japan. This contrasts with India, which is just sort of on a pedestal at the moment and being adored by all countries. And you can see that even last year with every single P5 leader visited India at some point during the last sort of 6 months of 2010, trying to strengthen relations. So I think looking forward, you can see that there's no one-size-fits-all policy when it comes to deterrence. The US is trying to address this in some ways and realizing that how domestic debate influences how Japan feels. So when there's a debate about decreasing spending on US military and increased spending in Chinese military, how that affects perceptions in Japan. But I think greater efforts need to be made to see what resolve is needed by Japan to feel secure. Because an ambiguity is a good thing when you're is a good thing for an adversary if they don't quite know what you're doing. But if you're the guarantee state, you need to be clear. So just to conclude, that the Fukushima crisis has had several outcomes, but I think it's also awakened the world and the potential dangers of a nuclear leakage, but also what an attack intending to use nuclear technology could release in the world. And whilst Japan and India share many similar threats, the issue with nuclear deterrence always comes down to credibility. And on this issue, Tokyo and Delhi view Washington's assurances very differently. And I think the fiasco of the Tenma bases in 2010 demonstrated the limitations that Japan actually has when trying to renegotiate the terms of the US-Japan alliance. And whilst Tokyo has been trying to get alternative relationships with India and Australia, when it comes to nuclear deterrence, it can only really rely on the US. So whilst global disarmament is an honourable goal, as Obama, I think, said in his speech in Prague, that it might not come through in his lifetime. And I think given the uncertain security environment that we're seeing today in Asia, it's unlikely to come about in mine as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You make my job as moderator very easy, and all staying in time. But nevertheless, we don't have a lot of time with these shorter sessions. We have about 30 minutes for question and answer, and so I'd like to use my power as moderator to ask 2 points of cooperation. If you can choose just one question you'd like to ask rather than a series of questions, and add a comment too if you'd like, that will let us have more questions. And also I'd like to group questions, so take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll come back to the panel. And I'm going to take privilege of asking the first question. Then I see you over there, sir. We've covered so much ground here, I think to the credit of Michael Oslin in composing the panel. But one commonality I see among the 3 presenters is there's a focus really on how the outside is affecting Japan, and how Japan is seeing that outside world, and how Japan is responding to that. But I wonder if, since we have this expertise here, if maybe starting with Sugio in a few minutes, if you could talk about how much you think in your deliberations about setting the new program guidelines, how much you think about Japan as the country that needs to reassure. So how China sees Japan's developing of what Martin called a more well-rounded capability, a more multifaceted capability. So how do you sort of see that play? Or similarly with India or with China, 2 countries I know that Martin and Vicky both follow a lot. How much is there a concern on the other side that Japan might be, reacting too much or developing too much capability? That would be my question. But we have a question over here, sir, please.
Thank you. Elbridge Colby, Center for Naval Analysis. This is a question mostly for Mr. Fackler, although obviously we'd be excited to have anybody else jump in. You emphasized a lot the Japanese deep concern about China, but I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that a little bit, because we often hear that and it sounds absolutely true, but then when you kind of talk about specific kind of security concerns like concern about territorial integrity or overt coercion, I tend to hear, get those things get dismissed. So I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about what is the nature of the Japanese anxiety that's sufficiently strong to propel this military modernization and development.
Thank you. Should we take this? Sure, in the back.
Jim Bonomo from the RAND Corporation. I have a question relating to yours about changes in Japanese emphasis. I was impressed in a recent visit to Djibouti with the large number of Japanese military there at Camp Lemonnier and the construction of the Japanese Self-Defense Force Center for Counter-Piracy, which in U.S. terms would be a base. This is obviously a significant investment when Mr. Fackler was emphasizing the severe constraints financially and otherwise the Japanese military are under. So this must be connected in some way within the Japanese conception of their proper role, not just in extended deterrence, but in their relation with the United States. It obviously addresses the counter-piracy that Dr. Tukey pointed out too. So how is this connected? Why is this justified in this interrelation we have?
Great, thanks. It seems like we have three somewhat related questions, so why don't we go back to the panel on this. Who would like to start?
Do you want to do your question first?
Sugio, should you start?
At first, I pick the easier question, that's, Japan's commitment to counter-piracy operation. And when MOD thought about, the counter-piracy, whether we should kick off the counter-piracy operation or not 2 or 3 years ago, at that time, we didn't think about the alliance management. That is for the sake of Japanese sea lines of communication security. So, the implication of the alliance management is just a byproduct, not the primary element to be considered in the first place. And about China, I think we have two questions. One thing, what specifically we are worried about China is, of course, okay, we don't worry about Chinese 5 or 10 divisions, very large-scale amphibious invasion against Japanese territory. But we are worried about if we show some windows of opportunities to, the territorial dispute, territorial issues, or East China Sea EEZ borderline dispute. If we show the windows of opportunity to them, they may extend their challenges, something like fait accompli or probing way. So that's really worry about that. To counter against such challenges, the reason why we invented the notion of dynamic deterrence is actually to counter with that. So not to show the windows of opportunity, we think Japanese self-defense force should increase the ISO operation or something like presence patrol operation in that area to deter, not to show windows of deterrence from Chinese view. So to do that, we need to be more, frequent steady state operation, everyday steady state operation. So that's the reason why we are picking word from static deterrence to dynamic deterrence. So this is what I want to say. And actually, the counter-piracy operation can have such dynamic implication on to deal with regional global security issues. And about Andrew's question about how do we worry about how to see a regional country is concerned from outside, that is again how to say. Again, we don't worry about Chinese large-scale conventional military invasion, but we worry about some kind of the windows of opportunity probing fait accompli situation. And so this is kind of unavoidable thing. With the modernization of Chinese military, it's very natural they increase their military activities. So it's very natural for us to increase our military activities. So what we need is to have some, crisis management mechanism, something like hotline or something like an emergency communication system like one. And so that's what I think. The second thing, I'm not sure how China worry about Japan. After the NDPG release, the official comment from China is just one thing, just against just one paragraph. One paragraph is how does Japanese government see China? That said, international community has very big concern on untransparent Chinese military modernization. And Chinese criticism to Japanese documents in DPG was how Japan can represent the international community. So that is Japanese government's interpretation, Japanese government view. That's not the international community. That is official Chinese, only official Chinese comments. Actually, I agree with that. So I personally think Japanese government should say, Japan worry about that. But they don't worry. They don't give us a very official criticism, counter argument to our, the dynamic deterrence, dynamic defense force, or as increasing presence in Okinawa areas. So,
Martin?
If I can take the questions in order with Andrew's question about Japanese remilitarization, I think is what you're asking about really. Are people worried about Japan marching across Asia again? I really think that the rise of China has changed that whole dynamic. When Japan was the power in Asia, either in real terms or potentially, that was a concern. But I think the rise of China has completely rewritten the script. And one area that I would point to as an example of where you see that kind of change is Japanese-South Korean military relations, which would have been like unthinkable until very recently. And now we're seeing, I believe South Korean observers were observing U.S.-Japan drills, and we saw Japanese observers observing U.S.-South Korean drills. And of course, the U.S. plays kind of a matchmaker role in some ways in this whole thing. I think it was Admiral Mullen, when he was in Seoul, I believe it was late last year, was actually calling for more Japanese-South Korean military cooperation. But the fact that this is becoming possible, I think it's a pretty good indicator of the fact that people who once suffered from Japanese colonialism no longer see Japan as that sort of danger. And in fact, with China over here, the new 800-pound gorilla, maybe we should learn how to get along with each other since we're both democracies, et cetera. And us being South Korea and Japan in that case. With the first question about anxiety in Japan, in terms of like actual military sort of things, I mean, the Chinese trawler captain incident in September, Japan had to back down. China put its foot down and Japan crumbled. And I think that there was a sense in Japan that if we had more capability, if we were stronger, we wouldn't have to give in like that. I mean, that was pretty humiliating, I mean, they basically arrested this guy. We're talking about being firm about Chinese intrusions into what Japan claimed as its territory. And then when the Chinese start, kind of pushing them around, they folded. And there's been a number of these kinds of things, but I think that would be, I think, one of the biggest. That was a big event in Japan. That got a lot of attention. And there's a number of things. Like a few years ago, there was a Chinese submarine that was going through Japanese territorial waters, and the Japanese were chasing it for like 48 hours or something. And there was an island, well, this is debatable. There was a body, a physical outcropping in the ocean called Okinotorishima, or Okinotori something, maybe I shouldn't call it Shima, which means island. But the Japanese say it's an island, the Chinese say it's a rock. And under the law of the sea, if it's an island, you get an EEZ around it, and if it's a rock, you don't. And the definition of an island is there sustainable economic activity, or is there habitation, human habitation? And if you have ever seen anything that describes okinatori, you know that the Chinese are a pretty good case. It's basically like two little outcroppings the size of sofas in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And it's just brilliant because the Japanese, they were afraid that a typhoon would come and knock these things over and deprive them of their island. So they built this 15-meter radius concrete fortification around one of the two, or maybe both of them, to protect it so it wouldn't be washed away, so the island was safe. And the Chinese started a few years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, started saying, no, it's a rock, it's not an island. And therefore you can't claim an EEZ around it, which is a significant swath of territory. And again, and the Chinese are always sort of provoking Japan around this rock or island. And it gets a lot of attention, but there's also the broader background here is territorial issues, which are very powerful, and we tend to forget. Like in Europe, they had a number of wars that kind of basically resolved these things, and the EU became possible because of all these horrible wars going back to the 19th century, where the Europeans basically slaughtered each other, but they worked out Alsace-Lorraine and all these things, and so now you can have an EU is possible. Why is there no Asian Union? It's not possible. The territorial disputes are too raw, they're too emotional. Japan has territorial disputes with every neighbor, everyone. China, Taiwan, Russia, South Korea, everyone. And Asia has this very sort of unsettled quality that way in terms of territorial issues, and also since ethnic identities are so powerful here, and in this sort of conception, these sort of tribal, like we're all Japanese, yada yada, that sort of stuff is so powerful and compelling here that that the emotions run very high, and so over something like the Senkakus or the Diaoyu, whatever you want to call them. To us, it's like there are a few uninhabited rocks owned by some guy who lives up in Saitama. But, to the Chinese and to the Japanese, this is part of, the emotions are very high here. And if the Chinese were to occupy those, which they very well could if Japan's not careful, I think that's a driver. It's like fear, those sorts of fears drive it. And more broadly, I think Chinese anxieties come from things like the rare earths export ban that China imposed after the Chinese trawler captain. The sense of Japanese economic decline that follows that. Also, that Chinese are now the biggest shoppers in Ginza. I mean, it's just stuff like that. You see that where, Ginza department stores now exist on Chinese money. And what a humiliation. 20 years ago, Japan was like the raison d'etre of Fifth Avenue or whatever. And now it's like, they rely on Chinese money to support their premium shopping area. So it's really, those things matter, in terms of public perceptions, which then drive the political. So. And in terms of Djibouti, all I can say there is I've never been there and I'd love to go. But that Japan, there is this sort of urge by Japan, I think, to become more of a normal partner. There's a normal nation, and if you talk about it in the context of the U.S., a normal partner. Koizumi, Prime Minister Koizumi seemed to talk about Japan becoming like the U.K. or Australia almost. And I think that's part of, that effort that Japan is trying to there is a sense of carrying more of a burden within the constraints of a pacifist constitution.
Victoria, do you have comments on this first round of questions?
Yeah, just a couple. I'm just going to say that saying what China thinks of Japan, what I found when India thinks of Japan, if anything, they probably think that India should nuclearize, and if there's anything that they could do to...
Japan should
nuclearize. They see... In India, a lot of the strategic community will say that because their concern is so much about China, even though you might not hear it in official rhetoric. And I agree exactly with what Martin and Takahashi-san said, that when it comes to the threat from China, it's not about military, it's not about nuclear, it's about these small little muscle flexing that China has become a lot more confident in doing recently. Not only economically, which you saw like when there were lots of strikes at Honda factories in China last year, sort of struck loads of fear in Japanese businessmen, thinking, where on earth, we just thought China was a safe bet economically, and then they started having to look elsewhere, like to India and other places. And just in the last 6 months, a year, what you've seen in the South China Sea with China's increasing confidence. And it's not just Japan that has territorial disputes with all its neighbours. China has disputes with a fair few of them as well. But this is all very much in the last year, so I don't know if perhaps in a year's time China might sort of calm down a little bit and its confidence might decrease. It's always changing. But on the sort of the trawler incident, so the impression that I got in London is that Japan came out fairly well from it because it was seen as quite restrained. It did have to back down, but surely that was better than being overtly aggressive about it. But obviously that would be different from what people in Japan and other countries think.
Great, thank you. There are lots of questions. So one question, one comment. Alan in the back, please.
Thank you. Alan Romberg, the Stimson Center. My question is to Professor Takahashi about deterrence. You point out among the issues the importance of the nuclear component in extended deterrence. Some years ago, even after when the U.S. had sort of made clear that it wasn't only going to be nuclear, there were other aspects to extended deterrence. If you raise this with Japanese in a reasonably public setting, there was sort of a shaking, and this would, if this got reported in a big way, it would become a huge political issue within Japan. From the guidelines that you cite, it seems to be taken care of by a phrase which talks about the nuclear element as a vital element, and that's in some of the U.S.-Japan documents as well. But I wonder if you could expand a little bit on this in terms of does that phrasing and so on really take care of the issue, or are people, at least in the strategic community in Japan, still focused on the question of whether if there were a nuclear threat to Japan and the U.S. said, well, there are lots of ways to respond to this, this would cause a great deal of concern?
Great. Yes, up front here. Why don't we take these two up front, actually? Go ahead, sir.
Mike Gerson, Center for Naval Analyses. Actually, my question follows well off the last question. Recognizing that assurance it has to do with lots of factors, political, economic, military, and nuclear is only one component of that whole thing. In terms of Japan's perception of the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrent commitment, how do you think specific capabilities or numbers affect those perceptions? The TLAMN issue was mentioned, but now that the United States doesn't have a sea-launched cruise missile, does that matter? Would further reductions matter? Does the health of the deterrent? How closely is Japan following debate about modernization, the stockpile, and everything else, and delivery vehicles? How does that affect the perceptions of reassurance?
Sir.
Really, and again, my question follows very much off of Mike's. Bruce McDonald with the United States Institute of Peace. David Sanger opened up a bit of what I'm going to ask about, and that is what happens. Let's say somehow we get down to a point where nuclear arms reductions become involving more than one country. There are several ways that could play out, but just to set the two extremes, one would be that there's a common ceiling for all countries, and that's what I think David Sanger discussed and mentioned briefly. Another would be that there'd be some sort of premium for the old traditional nuclear powers, i.e. the United States and Russia. And so my question is, I would want to ask, in a circumstance like that, and of course, my head hurts thinking about how multilateral nuclear arms control would be negotiated. But what would be the perception in Japan of the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrent in a further reduced environment under either, I think those two extremes, if you will, bracketed? What would be the reaction in Japan, and how viable would that be?
Great. Sugio, while you're thinking of the combined Washington question here, why don't we take one more from Laura up front here.
Hi, I'm Laura Saltman from the Carnegie Tsinghua Center. And I just have a question. We've been hearing a lot about China, and since I'm based in Beijing, I have to ask the question from a Beijing perspective. I'm struck by the use of constructive and active role in disarmament that was mentioned, and that linkage to extended deterrence. And I understand that fully from the Japanese perspective of not developing nuclear weapons. Now, the Chinese experts that I've encountered over the years will often say that Japan should actually develop a more independent role, that it shouldn't rely on extended deterrence from the United States. And I've often been surprised by that, and I found that interesting. They see it as a hindrance to disarmament. They see it as reinforcing the role of nuclear weapons and then also giving DPRK and others an excuse to develop them. So I was wondering about the reaction from within Tokyo, within Japan, to that argument. Do you see it as disingenuous, or do you see a contradiction? Thank you.
Sugio, from Washington and Beijing, you have a related question. What does the strategist say here within MOD? Sorry, one more? Sorry, let's get a mic for one more here.
It's actually another aspect of the extended deterrence question, and that is that for Japan, as you state in your guidance, Clark Murdoch from the Center for Strategic International Studies, that it's indispensable. But at the same time, President Obama in his Prague speech said that the first theme was to reduce the role and numbers of U.S. nuclear weapons. And Tom Donilon, his national security advisor, gave a speech in March in which he said, we will continue to reduce the role of and numbers of nuclear weapons. Kind of hard to square with an indispensable contribution of external deterrence, of which nuclear deterrence is a vital element.
Sugio?
I have many questions, and at first, one thing I should maybe confess is, NDP was released actually December 17th, I don't remember the specific date, around 20. And after that, I prepared to some counter argument or criticism to this extended deterrence paragraph. But except a few websites, most of all major journalists maybe didn't notice, why not, just passed this change, just didn't notice, I think. And so I was really surprised by that one thing. And, in every country, such major strategic document, when it releases, everyone wants to know the contents of that strategic document before official release. But after release, everyone lost their interest on that, just like QTR, MPR, and APG as well. So I think this is what is happening. And from the Japanese strategic expert, some of the experts clearly, this is good, clearly say this is good to show what do we think, does the Japanese government think on the extended deterrence, especially why we say the vital element or indispensable word under the current trend of the nuclear zero world is the total number of nuclear warheads in the world has reduced since the end of the Cold War. However, the number of countries who has nuclear weapon has increased, especially in this decade. And in this area, in this region, still China continues to develop or modernize the nuclear weapons. So in this sense, just like Prague speech, President Obama said, we should seek to, we will seek to the nuclear-free world, but as long as nuclear weapon exists, nuclear deterrent could play a very important role. This is actually a traditional Japanese policy. So the Prague speech is very close to Japanese traditional policy. So in this sense, under the current Northeast Asian regional strategic situation, nuclear element, nuclear components of strategic deterrence or U.S. extended deterrence is still very vital, very essential, very indispensable work. If other conditions permit to reduce the dependency on nuclear weapons, that's very fine, but not now. That's at least my personal opinion. And about what do you say? The specific capability or specific number of questions. Of course, for example, TRAM-N is just a marginal, just plays a marginal role. But, nuclear deterrent consists of a specific capability and specific weapon systems. So, we cannot forget about the specific capability question. So, of course, compared to TRAM-N or Trident T5, Trident T5 is more important. But still, the assessment of the evaluation of the role of a specific nuclear weapon is, I think, a very important issue. And, so in that sense, the consultation between Japan and the US is very important. And I think, did I talk? Then the multilateral strategic stability issues. Frankly speaking, in Japan, nuclear strategy specialist is about 5 or 10, very small. This small community worry about that, and especially, whether the trilateral strategic stability or trilateral MAD can be sustainable or, can be stable is a very big question in this small community. But I'm not sure this is shared by the broader public opinion.
Great. I saw our co-panelists furiously scribbling. We're almost out of time, but do you have a word or two? Then why don't we take one more question from the audience? Yes, sir.
Paul Schultz from the Carnegie Endowment in London. A question about strategic culture, the way things are talked about in public. Could panelists comment on the way that nuclear deterrence is discussed, how openly, how robustly in the internal politics in India and Japan? Specifically, are names mentioned? The names presumably being Pakistan, China, North Korea, maybe others, or is that regarded as provocative and insensitive?
Okay, so we've heard about a lot of changes in Japanese security policy, but what about the so-called nuclear allergy? Is there discussion? Martin, you're the reporter of the group. What have you found?
I don't hear a lot of discussion of nuclear policy. I mean, there was this time when Japan was seeking reassurances on the nuclear umbrella. And I think Clinton, Secretary of State Clinton actually came out and reassured Japan in public on this. And so there was sort of at that point it did come out, but I don't, I mean, in terms of like, the Chinese going to nuke us or something, you don't hear a lot of that kind of stuff. I think it's, and this maybe gets to the question that we had earlier on this side, which I don't think anybody answered, but I was thinking about your question as well, and this issue of, why don't people, essentially is why doesn't Asia sort of rethink its security arrangements, right? You had Hatayama in Japan sort of flirting with that, and then there's this pullback to Khan. Nomihyon in South Korea had a bit of that, but now we're with Im Yong-bak, who's very firmly with the U.S. In Southeast Asia, we have Vietnam of all countries calling for the U.S. to come in. I mean, it seems like, and maybe, I don't know the answer, but maybe the answer has something to do with the fact that if you look at who benefited the most from Bretton Woods and the whole U.S.-centered order, it's East Asia. It really is. We used to say 20 years ago that the Cold War is over and Japan won. But now East Asia is winning. And so, in a sense, it's a winning formula. Why mess with it? And when you look at China, I think China has a lot of confidence building. Like when you were telling me about the Chinese saying, why don't we get the U.S. out? I don't think anyone would believe them. I think that would just be seen as a fig leaf for Chinese to come in and push people around. The reason why the Japanese and South Americans should stay is to keep the Chinese from bullying them. I don't think people trust China. So, you're going to need a lot of confidence building on the Chinese part, and they have not been doing a very good job of that recently.
Well, I hope you agree this is a terrific first session of what I think will be a great set of discussions for the next few days. So if you'll join me in thanking our panelists. Thanks for coming.
We will now have a quick coffee break, and then we prepare the next 2 papers beside, so if you please take it. And then the next section